The radio died at dawn. Captain Victoria Vic Brennan pressed her eye to the scope as the first gray light bled across the horizon, 14 below zero. Her breath crystallized instantly in the sub-zero air. Below her, spread across the valley like abandoned chess pieces, 1,000 Marines waited to die. Every surface had transformed into sheets of deadly ice, rocks, weapons, skin. The battlefield had become a crystalline death trap. Through her scope, 3,000 yards down, Vic watched a young Marine, couldn't be older than 19, slam his entrenching tool against the permafrost. Again, sparks flew with each strike against the frozen earth. Even from this distance, she could see him weeping as he dug. He was digging his own grave, and he knew it. They all knew it. Sunrise would bring their execution. Then the radio crackled one final time, and everything changed. Quick pause before we continue. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world right now, let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're enjoying stories like this, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell because tomorrow's episode, it goes even deeper than this. The transmission was breaking up, distorted by atmospheric interference and the weight of desperation. All sniper teams, this is Overwatch Command. Execute Protocol 7. I repeat, execute Protocol 7. Withdraw to extraction point Delta. Acknowledge immediately. Protocol 7. The Emergency Abandonment Protocol. No questions permitted. No delays tolerated. No exceptions granted. It meant the situation was beyond salvation. It meant command was cutting their losses. It meant everyone capable of escape should flee immediately, and those who couldn't were now classified as acceptable casualties in a strategic calculation that didn't account for individual human lives. Vic's finger trembled over the transmit button. Around the valley perimeter, she knew other sniper teams were already dismantling their positions, already melting into the darkness towards safety, already choosing personal survival over the 1,000 men who would die without covering fire. 40 feet to her south, separated by a rocky ridge, her sister waited, and she faced the exact same impossible choice. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan had an identical scope, an identical rifle, an identical view of the doomed valley floor, and the same crushing decision weighing on her conscience. They had been inserted 72 hours earlier as advanced reconnaissance. 2 elite snipers working the elevated positions, gathering intelligence on enemy movements, reporting everything through proper military channels. They had performed their assigned duties flawlessly. They had reported the enemy buildup, the tactical positioning, the obvious preparation for ambush. And then 3rd Battalion had walked directly into hell anyway, because someone at headquarters decided their intelligence was questionable, the risk was acceptable, and the mission timeline couldn't accommodate delays. Now those 1,000 Marines were pinned in a kill zone with 0 air support. The weather had grounded everything with rotors or wings. No artillery support. They were beyond effective range of the fire base. No rescue operation. Command had already written them off as losses. Just 2 sisters on a ridgeline, watching good men prepare to die. What neither of them knew yet was that their next decision would end their careers, spark a military controversy that would reach the highest levels of command, and force the Marine Corps to question everything it believed about obedience and judgment. Vic looked through her scope at the young Marine again. He had abandoned his digging. He sat with his back pressed against his inadequate fighting hole, rifle resting across his knees, staring at the eastern horizon where light would soon flood across the world and trigger the final assault. "We have to acknowledge the order," Vic said quietly, her words barely audible over the wind. "They're waiting for our confirmation." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was calculating something. Vic knew exactly what. Angles, distances, wind speeds, the cold mathematics that separated life from death. "They'll all die," Sarah finally said, her voice flat with certainty. "Every single one of them. By 0700, that valley becomes a mass grave." Protocol is protocol, Vic replied, but the words felt hollow. Protocol was written by people who aren't watching this, Sarah countered. Vic closed her eyes. She had served in the Marines for 12 years. Sarah for exactly the same duration. They had enlisted together on the same day, trained together through every phase, deployed together to every combat zone. 18 minutes separated their births, and nothing substantial had separated them since. They had followed orders through 3 major deployments, 4 different theaters of operation, countless missions where the correct choice was obvious and difficult decisions were unnecessary. They had never once violated protocol. That was the difference between professionals and reckless cowboys. That was the foundation of unit survival. That was what their father, Master Sergeant Michael Brennan, had drilled into them before an improvised explosive device in Helmand Province had taught him that sometimes following orders meant dying anyway. If we stay, Vic said carefully, weighing each word, we face court-martial, end of career, possibly worse, prison time. And if we leave, Sarah said quietly, we face ourselves for the rest of our lives. The young Marine shifted position in the valley below. He extracted a photograph from his jacket, studied it in the pre-dawn darkness. Vic couldn't see the image details, but she understood its meaning. Everyone carried something, a face to remember, a reason to keep fighting, a reminder that somewhere beyond this frozen nightmare, normal life still existed. Vic made her decision. She reached down and switched off her radio. The small LED indicator that had glowed green for 72 continuous hours went dark. With that single action, she terminated her career, destroyed her future, and possibly forfeited her freedom. But in that darkness, she discovered something else: clarity, purpose. The same feeling her father must have experienced every time he chose to stand post, to lead dangerous patrols, to walk point-down roads that might erase him from existence. Sarah watched her sister's hand move toward the radio. For 3 full seconds, she remained absolutely motionless. Then she reached for her own radio. Darkness, silence. 2 positions, Sarah said, her voice steady as bedrock. Maximum separation for overlapping fields of fire. You take the southern approach. I'll cover the north. Conserve ammunition, every round counts. Shoot command structure targets only. Make every shot matter. They had worked together so extensively that tactical planning required only seconds. Each knew precisely what the other would do before words were spoken. They had shared a womb before they shared a battlefield. Some connections ran deeper than doctrine, stronger than protocol, more binding than any sworn oath. Sarah began crawling backward from her position, dragging her rifle and equipment. She would circle south, locate a new elevated position, establish her firing angle. They wouldn't communicate again except through action itself. Every muzzle flash would be a conversation. Every eliminated target would be a sentence in a shared language only they could speak. Vic adjusted her scope and settled into the grim mathematics of precision killing. The Brennan sisters had been born 18 minutes apart in a military hospital outside 29 Palms, California. Their father, Master Sergeant Michael Brennan, had been conducting field operations when labor started. He made it back just in time to meet his daughters through the nursery glass, still wearing his combat boots and desert camouflage, still carrying the smell of cordite and sand embedded in his uniform. He raised them alone after their mother departed. Some women couldn't endure the military lifestyle, the constant deployments, the crushing uncertainty, the long silences broken only by brief, cryptic phone calls from locations that couldn't be named. Their mother had lasted 4 years before the loneliness consumed her capacity to remain. She walked out when the twins were 4 years old. Michael never spoke negatively about her. He simply folded her absence into their daily routine and moved forward. That was the Marine way: adapt and overcome. The twins grew up in base housing, measuring time by deployment cycles rather than calendar years. They learned to read by studying their father's field manuals. They learned world geography through tracking the places he was sent. Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, back to Iraq, back to Afghanistan. Each deployment meant months of anxious waiting, of obsessively checking casualty reports, of holding their breath, of jumping at every knock on the door. But they learned something else too, something that would define their entire lives. They learned that some people run toward danger while others run away. And they learned definitively which kind of people they wanted to become. Michael taught them to shoot when they were 12 years old, not casually or for entertainment, but with the same systematic precision he applied to every aspect of military life. Breathing techniques, trigger control, wind reading, ballistics calculations. He taught them that marksmanship wasn't about violence, it was about mathematics made physical. Every bullet was a complex problem to be solved with discipline and science. The sisters approached this training differently. Vic treated marksmanship like a mathematical equation. She studied ballistics tables obsessively, memorized wind formulas, maintained detailed logs of every single shot. Her targets displayed perfect center mass groupings. Her performance was consistent, predictable, and technically excellent. She could explain exactly why every round went precisely where it went. Sarah shot by instinct and feel. She could sense wind shifts before they manifested. She understood bullet trajectories through intuition rather than calculation. Her groupings were tighter than Vic's, but she couldn't always articulate how she achieved them. She just knew. Michael recognized what he had created, two complementary approaches to the identical problem, Vic's precision and Sarah's intuition. Together they could reach performance levels neither could achieve independently. "You're two halves of one perfect sniper," he told them once, watching them burn through ammunition at the range. Vic's analytical brain combined with Sarah's battlefield instinct. Don't ever forget that fundamental truth. Don't ever try to become the other person. Just be the absolute best version of yourself. When they turned 18, they enlisted together. Same day, same recruiter, same oath of service. Michael stood in the back of the ceremony, 42 years old, 24 years of continuous service, watching his daughters begin the journey he had walked before them. He deployed to Helmand Province 6 months later. The IED was concealed in an irrigation ditch. The blast killed him and 3 others instantly. By the time the twins received emergency leave to attend the funeral, he had already been buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 60, where the new wars placed their dead. A white marble headstone among thousands of identical white headstones, each marking someone who had chosen to stand post. Sarah wanted to quit that day, walk away from the Marines, from the wars, from all of it. Vic talked her down during the long night following the funeral, sitting on cheap hotel beds in their dress blues, splitting a bottle of whiskey their father would never drink. "He didn't die for nothing," Vic said firmly. "He died doing exactly what he believed in. Walking away doesn't honor that sacrifice. Finishing what we started, that honors it." Sarah had nodded, drunk and grieving and furious at a world that took fathers and gave back folded flags. They returned to their units. They trained harder than ever. They volunteered for every advanced school, every qualification course, every opportunity to become better at the craft their father had taught them. Scout Sniper School came 3 years into their service. The course maintained a 93% washout rate. Most candidates broke during the stalking exercises, crawling through brush for hours, covering mere yards of ground, trying to approach observer towers without being detected. Others broke during the shooting qualifications, where anything less than perfect meant immediate failure. Vic and Sarah didn't break. They finished first and second in their class. Vic's written examinations achieved the highest scores in the school's history. Sarah's field performance set records that still stood years later. The instructors struggled to rank them because they excelled in different aspects of the identical discipline. Eventually, They simply noted that the Brennan sisters represented a complete sniper capability split across two separate bodies. Their reputation spread rapidly through the tight-knit sniper community. Twin sisters, both fully qualified, both deadly effective, both carrying their father's legacy like rifle slings across their shoulders. They deployed together to Kandahar, then Mosul, then locations that never appeared in news reports. They operated as a unified team, which violated conventional doctrine. Standard sniper employment emphasized individual hides and individual shots. But their commanders quickly learned that the Brennan sisters produced extraordinary results. Enemy officers who believed themselves safe behind established lines would simply drop without warning. Weapons caches that had remained hidden for months would suddenly be reported with precise coordinates. The sisters observed details others missed. They communicated without speaking. A decade of shared existence meant they had developed a language of glances and gestures more precise than radio traffic. But beneath their shared profession, they were fundamentally different people. Vic believed in rules and established protocols. Regulations existed for concrete reasons, hard lessons learned through blood and catastrophic failures. She had been formally counseled twice during her career, both times for refusing orders she believed endangered her team through inadequate planning. She would break rules, but only after carefully weighing all consequences. Rebellion for her was calculated risk, never impulse. Sarah believed in outcomes and results. She would follow regulations that made tactical sense and ignore ones that didn't. She had been formally counseled 5 times, twice for ignoring movement orders to maintain overwatch on friendly units, once for engaging targets outside her designated sector, twice for refusing extraction while friendly forces remained in active contact. For Sarah, the mission was whatever kept people alive, regardless of what the operations order specified. Their philosophical differences had led to their current career trajectories. Vic was a captain, on track for promotion, respected by command structures. Sarah was still a lieutenant, passed over twice for advancement, regarded as talented but fundamentally unreliable by senior officers. Michael would have understood both of them completely. He had raised them to think independently, to question authority when authority was demonstrably wrong. But he had also taught them that the institution was larger than any individual, and that discipline maintained the line between order and chaos. Now, on a frozen ridgeline above a valley of dying Marines, those different philosophies were converging toward the identical conclusion. Vic, who believed in protocol, was breaking it. Sarah, who trusted instinct, was trusting her sister's judgment. And somewhere in the space between those decisions, 1,000 lives hung in the balance. Dawn approached with inevitable certainty. Gray light spread across the ridgeline, painting the world in shades of pearl and promise. Sarah had reached her southern position by now. Vic couldn't see her, but she knew. The same way she always knew where her sister was positioned, even in darkness, even in chaos, even across distance and disrupted senses, they remained connected. 17 minutes until sunrise. 17 minutes to prepare for a battle they couldn't win but couldn't avoid. Vic checked her ammunition count, 47 rounds. Sarah would have the same, 94 rounds total between them. The enemy had at least 2,000 fighters positioned around the valley rim waiting for dawn to launch their assault. The numbers didn't work, but numbers had never stopped them before. Vic remembered something their father had said during one of those childhood shooting lessons, watching them burn through box after box of ammunition at the range. "Shooting isn't about the bullets you have," Michael had said. "It's about the fear you create with the bullets you place. Make them afraid of the dark, make them afraid of distance, make them believe they're fighting ghosts." That was the game now, not killing 2,000 fighters, but creating the illusion that help had arrived, that the Marines below weren't alone, that salvation existed on the ridgeline, invisible and unstoppable. Through her scope, Vic found the enemy officer she had been tracking. He had moved closer, positioned forward to observe his troops' final preparations. He carried himself differently than the soldiers around him, authority in his posture, command in his gestures. She centered the crosshairs on his chest, then moved up slightly to the head. This first shot had to be absolutely perfect. It had to be shocking. It had to make everyone watching believe that something impossible had just occurred. Sarah would be aiming at her own target now, some other officer, some other symbol of command. They would shoot within seconds of each other, not coordinated by watch or signal, but by that deeper rhythm they shared. The synchronization of twins who had moved together since before birth. The enemy officer straightened and turned, presenting his profile cleanly against the morning sky. Vic breathed in, held it, let her heart beat slow to the steady drum of someone who had made peace with consequence. She thought of her father buried in Arlington. She thought of the young Marine in the valley, sitting by his inadequate hole, waiting for death. She thought of Sarah, 40 feet away, making the same calculations, the same impossible choice. She thought of the oath they had taken, to support and defend, to bear true faith and allegiance, to obey the orders of the officers appointed over them. She thought of the higher oath, the one that wasn't written down but lived in the spaces between the words. To protect those who couldn't protect themselves, to stand when others ran, to make the hard call when the right call meant sacrifice. 15 minutes to dawn. The young Marine was standing now, rifle in hand, staring at the horizon, probably praying, probably thinking of the photograph in his pocket, probably wondering if this was really how it ended, frozen and afraid and so impossibly far from home. Vic's finger completed its pressure on the trigger. The rifle spoke. And 3,700 yards away, an enemy officer who had been planning his assault suddenly lost his ability to plan anything at all. The war for the valley had begun. The bullet took 3.7 seconds to travel from Vic's rifle to the target. In that time, the officer moved slightly, not enough to matter, but enough that the round struck 2 inches lower than Vic had aimed. It hit him in the throat instead of the head. Through the scope, she watched him drop. Watched the spray of arterial blood appear black in the pre-dawn light. Watched the soldiers around him scatter, diving for cover, uncertain where death had originated. 2 seconds later, another officer fell on the southern approach. Sarah's shot, center mass, textbook perfect. The enemy troops descended into chaos. Officers barking orders at an invisible threat. Soldiers scanning ridgelines with the panicked movements of prey animals. They had been preparing to attack, and suddenly they were being attacked. Vic worked her bolt. The empty casing ejected, spinning away into darkness. She chambered another round and was already scanning for her next target before the brass struck stone. The doctrine of sniper employment was absolutely clear. 1 shot, 1 kill, then relocate immediately. Never fire twice from the same position. The enemy would triangulate your muzzle flash, call in mortars or counter sniper fire, and you would die in the hole you were too stubborn to leave. But doctrine assumed you had somewhere to relocate to. It assumed you valued personal survival over mission success. It assumed you weren't trying to save 1,000 Marines with 94 bullets. Vic stayed put and found her second target, a platoon leader rallying his troops, pointing toward the valley floor. He was skilled, getting his people organized, restoring order. That made him a priority problem. She shot him through the chest. He fell backward, and the soldiers he'd been directing scattered again. The chaos was spreading like ripples across a pond. 3 commanders down in 90 seconds. Nobody knew how many snipers they were facing. Nobody knew where the shots were originating. Nobody wanted to be the 4th officer to die. Sarah fired again. Vic couldn't see the target, but she recognized the rhythm of her sister shooting. Steady, methodical, making every round count. Down in the valley, the Marines were starting to realize something was happening. Vic could see them pointing at the enemy positions, watching the disruption spread through the opposing force. They didn't know what was causing it, but they knew the attack hadn't come yet, and that was hope where none had existed before. A radio crackled, not Vic's, which she had turned off, but the enemy's tactical network. She had a scanner in her gear bag, preset to common frequencies. The voice was frantic, speaking a language she didn't need to translate to understand the meaning. They were reporting snipers. Multiple snipers, long-range precision fire, casualties among leadership. Good, let them believe in multiples. Let them believe they were facing an entire platoon of ghosts instead of 2 women with a death wish. Vic shifted her aim to the eastern approach. The sun was nearly up now, painting the horizon in shades of amber and gold. Beautiful morning for dying. She found a cluster of soldiers preparing a heavy machine gun. The weapon could shred the Marines below once the attack began. The crew was working efficiently, gunner, assistant gunner, ammunition handler. Well trained. She shot the gunner first. He collapsed across the weapon. The assistant gunner reached for him, trying to pull him away, and Sarah's rifle spoke from the south. The assistant gunner crumpled. The ammunition handler looked around wildly, then abandoned the gun and ran. Smart choice. 4 minutes to sunrise. The enemy was supposed to be attacking by now. Instead, they were pinned by an invisible threat they couldn't locate or suppress. But they had resources that Vic and Sarah didn't. Within seconds of the machine gun crew going down, Vic heard a new sound, the distinctive whump-whump of mortars being deployed. They weren't targeting the valley anymore. They were targeting the ridgeline. The first mortar round landed 300 yards south of Vic's position. Too far to be dangerous, but close enough to show they were guessing her location. The second round landed closer, 200 yards. They were walking fire along the ridgeline, trying to flush her out or kill her through saturation bombardment. Vic didn't move. Movement would give away her position more surely than staying still. She pressed herself flat against the rock and kept shooting, a squad leader organizing his troops. Gone. A soldier with a radio, likely a forward observer calling in those mortars. Gone. A fighter trying to drag a wounded comrade to safety. She hesitated on that one. Shooting wounded or those rendering aid violated the rules of warfare. But he was also carrying a rifle, also part of the enemy force. And she couldn't afford mercy when 1,000 Marines were depending on her bullets. She shot him in the leg, not lethal but enough to take him out of the fight. A compromise with her conscience. The mortars were getting closer. Sarah would be facing the same problem. They couldn't stay in these positions much longer, but they couldn't leave either. Moving meant losing the angles, losing the effectiveness, losing the illusion that the ridgeline was filled with defenders. Vic made a decision. She switched her radio back on, not to command, she had burned that bridge, but to the Marines in the valley. They would be monitoring their tactical frequency. She keyed the microphone and spoke quietly, calmly, with the voice of someone in complete control. Any Marine receiving this transmission, this is Overwatch. You have sniper support on the ridgeline. Maintain your positions. Help is coming. Sunrise protocol is in effect. Acknowledge if you copy. Silence for 3 seconds, then a voice, young and cracking with emotion. Overwatch, this is 3rd Battalion actual. We copy, we thought we were alone. Vic's throat tightened. You're not alone, Battalion. Hold your positions. Make them pay for every yard. We've got your back. Who are you? Ghosts, Vic said and turned the radio back off. She went back to shooting. The mortars were landing in a predictable pattern now, walking north along the ridgeline. They would reach her position in the next salvo. She could stay and die or move and break the illusion. Sarah made the choice for her. Another shot from the south, but this one wasn't aimed at enemy troops. It was aimed at the mortar position itself. 3,500 yards, extreme range, shooting at a target she could probably barely see. The round hit one of the mortar tubes dead center. Vic didn't know if Sarah had been aiming for the tube or the crew, but the effect was spectacular. The mortar round that had been loaded into the tube detonated, and the entire position went up in a cascade of secondary explosions. The mortar fire stopped. Vic allowed herself a tight smile. That was Sarah. When doctrine said, hide and wait, she said, attack the problem directly. The sun broke the horizon. Golden light spilled across the valley floor, illuminating 1,000 Marines who had survived to see it. They were battered, exhausted, probably low on ammunition, but they were alive. And the attack that was supposed to come with dawn hadn't come. Instead, the enemy was reorganizing, taking casualties, trying to figure out how to fight an opponent they couldn't see. Vic scanned the valley rim through her scope. She counted at least 30 bodies, enemy soldiers and officers who would never see another sunset. Sarah had probably accounted for another 15 on the southern approach. 45 enemy down, 49 rounds expended between them. 955 enemy fighters remaining, 45 rounds left. The mathematics still didn't work, but the psychology was shifting. Through her scope, Vic saw something that made her heart sink and soar simultaneously, vehicles moving toward the valley from the east, not enemy reinforcements. These were different, larger, moving in the distinctive pattern of a mechanized column. For one terrible moment, she thought command had sent armor to finish what the ambush had started. Then she recognized the profiles, American vehicles, reinforcements for the Marines below. Someone had countermanded the withdrawal order, or the situation had changed priority. Or some officer somewhere had decided 1,000 lives were worth the risk after all. Help was coming. Real help with armor and infantry and all the resources that Vic and Sarah didn't have. They had bought enough time. The Marines would survive. Vic keyed her radio one final time. 3rd Battalion Overwatch armor column approaching from east. ETA 15 minutes. Hold position and prepare for friendly arrival. Overwatch, we copy. Thank you. We, whoever you are, thank you. Vic didn't respond. She safed her rifle and began the process of withdrawing from her position. Sarah would be doing the same from the south. They needed to be gone before the reinforcements arrived, before anyone asked questions about who had been providing sniper support, before the investigation began. They had saved 1,000 Marines, and in doing so they had ended their careers. The only question now was how high the price would climb. The withdrawal took hours. Vic moved like smoke across the ridgeline, using every depression and shadow to mask her movement. The enemy was still out there, still dangerous, still hunting for the snipers who had devastated their attack. She covered 3 miles in 4 hours, moving at the pace of caution rather than speed. Sarah would be paralleling her route on the southern slope. They had planned this during their initial insertion, multiple exfiltration routes, coded rally points, contingencies for contingencies. Now those plans were keeping them alive. The terrain was brutal, frozen scree that shifted under every step. Ice sheets that could send you sliding down a cliff face. Wind that cut through gear and skin like a blade. Vic's hands were numb despite her gloves. Her face burned with cold despite the scarf wrapped around it. She moved anyway, stopped when necessary, used the scope to scan ahead before committing to each new section of ground. This was the part of combat that never made the stories, the grinding hours of exhaustion and discomfort, the slow work of staying alive. Behind her she heard the sounds of battle resuming. The armor had arrived. The Marines were being reinforced. The enemy was withdrawing, their attack broken, their leaders dead, their confidence shattered. The valley was being held. Vic allowed herself no sense of victory. Victory meant questions. Victory meant investigations. Victory meant someone would want to know who had ignored Protocol 7 and why. She reached the first rally point by midday, a cluster of rocks that formed natural shelter, marked on their map with coordinates that meant nothing to anyone but the two of them. Sarah wasn't there yet. Vic waited, checked her watch. Sarah should have reached this point 30 minutes ago if she had moved at normal pace. 45 minutes ago if she had been delayed by enemy patrols. An hour passed. Vic felt the first touch of real fear. Sarah was never late. Even in training, even in exercises where timing didn't matter, Sarah had an internal clock that was never wrong. If she wasn't here, something had happened. Vic forced herself to think tactically. Sarah could be pinned down, could be injured, could be taking an alternate route for reasons Vic couldn't know. Moving to search for her meant exposing herself, risking both of them, possibly creating a crisis where none existed. She waited another hour. Used the time to strip and clean her rifle, check her remaining ammunition, eat from the cold rations in her pack. Professional habits to keep panic at bay. Her radio crackled, Sarah's voice barely a whisper. North route compromised, taking South Ridge, 2 hours. Vic exhaled. Copy, see you soon. The transmission ended short, encoded, using terms that would sound like static to anyone scanning frequencies. Sarah was alive, moving, delayed, but not in immediate danger. Vic settled in to wait. The sun tracked across the sky. The temperature rose from brutal to merely bitter. In the distance, she could see helicopters moving over the valley, medevac birds extracting wounded, cargo birds bringing in supplies. The Marines were being taken care of. The system was working now that someone in command had decided they were worth saving. Sarah appeared exactly 2 hours later, materializing from the rocks like she had been born from stone. She looked exhausted, face wind-burned, eyes red-rimmed, moving with the careful precision of someone at the end of their reserves. Ran into a patrol, Sarah said quietly, dropping her pack. Had to detour 5 miles east, stayed hidden in a crevasse for an hour while they searched. She pulled out her water bottle, took a long drink. They're looking hard, we hurt them. We saved them, Vic corrected. Same thing depending on perspective. Sarah sat down heavily. What's the plan? Vic had been thinking about that for hours. Command knows someone stayed behind. They'll investigate. They'll find evidence, shell casings, disturbance patterns, ballistics. Eventually, they'll figure out it was us. How long? Sarah asked. Days, maybe a week if we're lucky. Sarah nodded. She had known this was coming. They both had. Court-martial, Vic said. Best case scenario. Worst case, they make an example, dereliction of duty during combat operations, refusing direct orders, operating outside chain of command. Vic listed the charges like an inventory of their sins. We could be looking at years in military prison. Worth it? Sarah asked. Is it? Sarah looked at her sister. 1,000 Marines went home. 1,000 Marines saw another sunrise. Yeah, it's worth it. Vic wanted to argue, to point out that principle and practicality weren't the same thing, that sacrifice without strategy was just waste. But she couldn't, because she had made the same choice Sarah had. She had turned off her radio knowing exactly what it meant. We need to get to the extraction point, Vic said. Turn ourselves in before they send hunters after us. Or, Sarah said slowly, we disappear. Vic stared. What? We disappear, Sarah repeated. We're good at being invisible. We walk away, new identities, new lives. Let command think we died on that ridge. Sarah, I'm serious. We've got skills. We've got training. We could survive outside the system. As what? Vic shook her head. Mercenaries, criminals, that's not who we are. No, we're the people who followed orders until following orders meant watching people die. Then we broke protocol. Sarah's voice was hard. If we turn ourselves in, command destroys us to protect the protocol we broke. We become the lesson, the warning, the reason why everyone else has to obey without question. Vic had no counterargument because Sarah was right. That was exactly what would happen. Command couldn't allow their defiance to go unpunished. The military ran on discipline. If 2 snipers could pick and choose which orders to follow, the entire structure became negotiable. Dad wouldn't have run, Vic said quietly. Dad died following orders, Sarah shot back. You want that to be our memorial too. They sat in silence, watching the afternoon light paint shadows across the mountains. 2 sisters, 2 rifles, 2 diverging visions of what came next. Finally, Vic spoke. If we run, we prove them right, that we were reckless, that we put ourselves above the mission, that we can't be trusted. And if we turn ourselves in, we're martyrs to a system that was willing to let 1,000 Marines die because the paperwork said they were acceptable losses. So what do we do? Sarah smiled, not with humor, but with the grim recognition of someone who had seen the same problem from every angle. We do what we've always done. We take the shot we can make and deal with consequences later. The extraction point is 40 miles south, Vic said. Command will have people there. Once we arrive, we're in custody. Then we don't arrive, Sarah said. We find another way. There is no other way. We're in hostile territory. No support, limited supplies. Vic checked her ammunition count. I've got 22 rounds left. You, 18. 40 rounds between us against an entire region that wants us dead or captured, Sarah shrugged. We faced worse odds this morning when we decided 2 rifles could save a battalion. Vic couldn't help it. She laughed, a short, sharp bark of recognition. Sarah was right. They had already committed to the impossible. Everything after that was just details. Okay, Vic said. So we evade, we survive, then what? Then we get home, back to the States. We tell our story not to command, but to everyone, public, media, make it impossible for them to bury us quietly. Sarah's eyes were bright with tactical thinking. They can court-martial us, but they can't silence us, not if the whole country knows what happened in that valley. It was a plan, not a good plan. It had about 100 ways to fail and maybe 2 ways to succeed. But it was better than surrender and better than running forever. We'll need to move at night, Vic said, already thinking logistics. Avoid population centers, live off the land as much as possible. I know a route. Sarah pulled out a folded map from her jacket, marked with pencil lines and notations. Figured we might need a way out someday. You've been planning this. I've been planning for us to have options. There's a difference. Vic studied the map. The route Sarah had marked took them through some of the roughest terrain in the region, mountain passes, river valleys, areas where even the enemy didn't maintain regular patrols. It would take weeks. It would be brutal. People would be hunting them from multiple directions. It might work. When do we move? Vic asked. Dark, 4 hours. Sarah repacked the map. Get some rest. When we start moving, we don't stop until we're clear. Vic nodded. She should have felt fear. They were about to become fugitives from their own military while trapped in hostile territory. Instead, she felt something else, purpose, clarity. The same feeling she had felt on the ridgeline when she decided to turn off her radio. Some decisions transcended doctrine. Some choices were about looking at yourself in the mirror for the next 50 years. She closed her eyes and tried to rest. In 4 hours, they would begin the longest mission of their lives. No support, no backup, no one coming to save them. Just 2 sisters, 40 bullets, and a long walk home. They moved through darkness like water through cracks. Vic led the first leg, navigating by terrain memory and starlight. No GPS. Those signals could be tracked. No radio, same problem. Just old-fashioned land navigation, using the mountains as reference points and dead reckoning to measure distance. Sarah followed 20 yards behind, watching their back trail, ensuring they left minimal sign. They moved in 30-minute increments, then stopped to listen. Listening was the most important skill in evasion. Your ears told you what your eyes couldn't see: distant engines, radio chatter, the distinctive sound of organized movement through terrain. For the first 3 hours, they heard nothing but wind and their own breathing. Then, around midnight, they heard helicopters. The sound came from the north. Multiple rotors, probably search birds with thermal imaging. They were sweeping the ridgeline where Vic and Sarah had been positioned, looking for bodies, looking for evidence, looking for the snipers who had saved a battalion and vanished. Vic and Sarah pressed themselves into a ravine, covering themselves with loose rock and vegetation. The thermal blankets in their packs would mask their heat signatures, but only if they remained perfectly still. Even the slight warmth of breath could show up as an anomaly on sensitive equipment. The helicopters passed overhead, searchlights painting the rocks in harsh white illumination. Vic counted seconds between sweeps, calculating search patterns. They were being thorough. Someone important wanted answers. After 20 minutes, the helicopters moved on, continuing their grid search to the west. Vic and Sarah waited another 30 minutes to be certain, then emerged from cover and kept moving. By dawn, they had covered 12 miles, not fast, but sustainable. And more importantly, they had moved perpendicular to the direction command would expect. The extraction point was south. They were heading southwest, toward the border regions where authority became negotiable and terrain made pursuit difficult. They found shelter in an abandoned shepherd's hut, barely more than stacked stones and a partial roof, but enough to hide them during daylight hours. Sarah took first watch while Vic tried to sleep. She couldn't. Her mind kept returning to the valley, to the young Marine she'd watched digging in frozen ground. Was he alive? Had the reinforcements arrived in time? Would he ever know who had been on that ridgeline? Probably not. The military would classify the incident. The official record would show that the battalion was reinforced by conventional forces, that casualties were acceptable, that protocol was followed. The sisters who had defied orders to save them would become a footnote if they were mentioned at all. Unless they made it home, unless they told the story themselves, Vic drifted into uneasy sleep, her hands still wrapped around her rifle. Sarah woke her 4 hours later. Movement east, maybe 3 miles. Vic was instantly alert. What kind? Foot patrol, sounds organized, could be ours, could be theirs. Either way, we don't want contact. They packed quickly and moved deeper into the mountains. The terrain was working against them now. The higher they climbed, the more exposed they became, but exposure was better than capture. They traveled for 6 more hours, stopping frequently to check their back trail. The patrol Sarah had heard never appeared. Maybe it had turned back. Maybe it was still searching. Maybe it was coordinating with other units, setting up a net. By nightfall, they had gained another 15 miles. 27 total, a marathon distance under normal conditions. In mountains with full gear while evading pursuit, it was exceptional. It was also unsustainable. They couldn't maintain this pace for weeks. We need to find supplies, Sarah said during their night halt. Water especially. We're down to half a canteen each. Vic knew. They had passed several streams, but water in this region was questionable without purification. They had tablets but limited supply. Food was also becoming an issue. Their rations would last maybe 4 more days if they rationed carefully. There's a village, Vic said, checking her map. 20 miles southwest, remote, probably not worth military attention. We could buy supplies. With what currency? Sarah asked. We've got American dollars and military scrip. Both will mark us as foreign. Sarah pulled out a small pouch from her pack. Inside were gold coins, local currency from their initial insertion, meant for emergency use with informants, maybe $50 worth in total. Emergency enough? Sarah asked. Vic nodded. We go in separately. You buy food. I buy water and supplies. Meet at the northern edge, 1 hour maximum. And if one of us doesn't make it out, Vic said matter-of-factly, the other keeps moving. The words tasted like ash. The thought of continuing without Sarah was unbearable, but sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford. They reached the village around midnight. It was small, maybe 30 buildings, mostly dark. A few lights showed in windows. Somewhere a dog barked at shadows. Sarah went first. She had a gift for blending in, for moving through spaces without drawing attention. Vic watched from a distance as her sister entered a small shop that was still open, probably serving locals who worked night shifts or travelers passing through. Vic approached from the other side, finding a different shop. The proprietor was an old man, half asleep behind his counter. She used hand gestures and her limited language skills to purchase water bottles, dried fruit, bread. The man barely looked at her, taking the coins and making change with the automatic motions of someone who had done this transaction 1,000 times. She was back on the street in 10 minutes. Sarah emerged from her shop 5 minutes later. They met at the northern edge of the village, exchanged nods, and kept walking. It wasn't until they were a mile clear that Sarah spoke. Someone was asking about Americans. Vic's hand tightened on her rifle. Where? In the shop. Outside. I heard it through the window. Man asking if anyone had seen foreign soldiers, offering money. Bounty hunters or intelligence gathering, Vic said. Either way, someone knows we're in the region. They picked up their pace. The village had been a risk, but a necessary one. Now it was a marker on the map that would tell their pursuers which direction to search. For 3 more days they moved through the mountains, climbing, descending, following ridgelines and stream beds, avoiding roads and settlements, living off the supplies they had bought and whatever they could forage. On the 4th day they heard helicopters again, closer this time. The search pattern had shifted. Whoever was hunting them had adjusted their search radius. They had found something, a track, a sign, or they were guessing better than Vic and Sarah were evading. "They found something," Vic said. "Or they're reading us better than we're hiding," Sarah countered. That night they made a decision. Instead of continuing southwest toward the border, they would turn directly south, then loop east, a longer route but one that would take them through terrain too rough for helicopters to search effectively. It added a week to their journey, maybe 2. They would run out of supplies, they would have to risk another village or find another source. But they would be alive. The 5th day, the weather turned. Snow began falling, light at first, then heavy. Visibility dropped to yards, temperature plummeted. It was the kind of storm that killed unprepared travelers. Vic and Sarah had trained in worse. They used the storm as cover, pushing through conditions that would ground helicopters and halt foot patrols. They covered 20 miles in 18 hours, leaving tracks that would be erased by snowfall within minutes. When the storm finally broke, they were 40 miles from where the search had focused. They had gained breathing room, but Vic knew it wouldn't last. Someone wanted them badly enough to commit resources. Command didn't chase ghosts unless those ghosts represented a problem, and 2 snipers who had ignored Protocol 7 were definitely a problem. The question was how much of a problem and how far Command would go to solve it. They found the abandoned military outpost on day 9. It sat on a ridge overlooking a narrow valley, one of dozens of positions that had been built during earlier conflicts and then left to decay when the wars moved elsewhere. The walls were crumbling. The roof mostly collapsed, but the foundation was sound and the location gave them a commanding view of the terrain below. More importantly, it had a cache. Every outpost maintained supply caches, hidden stores of ammunition, medical supplies, rations. The military rarely recovered them during withdrawals. Too much effort, too little value. But for 2 fugitives running on empty supplies, a cache was salvation. Sarah found it under a loose stone in what had been the communications room. A metal container sealed and buried, untouched for years. Inside, 6 boxes of ammunition matching their rifles, field dressings, water purification tablets, a dozen MREs that were probably expired but still edible, and something else. A journal, field notebook, standard issue, the kind every soldier carried. Sarah opened it, flipped to the last entry. "Vic, you need to see this." Vic read over her sister's shoulder. The entry was dated 3 years ago. February 2022. Protocol 7 called, Battalion Alpha trapped in the Korangal. We had the shot, we had the angle, we could have saved them. Command said withdraw, we withdrew. 400 Marines died that night. We followed orders. We did our duty. We came home alive. I can't sleep anymore. I see their faces. I hear them calling for help that never came. We followed protocol and they died. God help me, I would give anything to go back and break those orders, but I can't. All I can do is write this and hope that someday someone finds it, someone who faces the same choice. And I hope they're braver than we were. The entry wasn't signed, just initials. J.M. Vic felt something cold settle in her stomach. This had happened before. Other snipers had faced the same choice. They had obeyed Protocol 7 and their battalion had died. We did what they couldn't, Sarah said quietly. Vic kept reading. There were other entries, earlier missions, normal operations, then that final entry, the one that ended everything. How many times? Vic whispered. How many times has Protocol 7 killed people? Doesn't matter now, Sarah said. What matters is we broke the pattern. We chose different. Vic closed the journal, tucked it into her pack. Evidence. Proof. Something to show that this wasn't just about 2 reckless snipers. This was about a systemic problem, a protocol that prioritized assets over lives. They spent the night in the outpost, taking turns on watch. For the first time in 9 days, Vic felt something like hope. They had supplies, they had evidence, they had a route. They might actually make it. The next morning, they continued south. The border region was close now. Not an official border with checkpoints and customs, but the fuzzy zone where one country's authority faded and another's hadn't quite taken hold. If they could reach that zone, they could find people who didn't care about military protocols. Smugglers, traders, fixers who moved people and goods across borders for the right price. With the remaining gold coins and possibly their weapons as barter, they might be able to arrange transport to somewhere safer. From there, it was a matter of finding an embassy, making contact with sympathetic journalists, telling their story before command could bury it. It was a long shot, but all their shots had been long. On day 11, they encountered people. A small group, 6 or 7 individuals traveling on foot with pack animals, not military, probably traders or nomads moving goods between regions that didn't show up on official maps. Vic and Sarah watched from a distance, trying to decide. These people might have information, they might have supplies to trade, they might also have radios, might be willing to report foreign soldiers for a reward. "Your call," Sarah said quietly. Vic studied the group through her scope. Their body language was relaxed. They weren't moving tactically. They stopped to rest, to water their animals, to share food, just people trying to make a living in a hard land. "We approach openly," Vic decided. "Weapons visible but not threatening. See if they'll trade." They moved down from their observation position, making noise deliberately so they wouldn't appear to be ambushing. The traders spotted them immediately, went tense, reached for whatever weapons they carried. Then they saw it was just 2 women alone, moving without aggression. The leader stepped forward. He was old, maybe 60, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades under harsh sun. He spoke in the local language, which Vic barely understood. She replied in slow, careful phrases. "We seek trade." "Food for gold." The old man studied them. His eyes lingered on their rifles, on their gear, on the way they carried themselves. He knew what they were. The question was whether he cared. He named a price, outrageous, 3 times what the supplies were worth. Vic countered. The old man laughed and came down slightly. They settled on a price that was still too high but survivable. Vic handed over coins. The old man produced dried meat, flatbread, cheese wrapped in cloth. Real food, not military rations. As they were concluding the trade, the old man spoke again. Vic caught only part of it, but the meaning was clear. "Helicopters search for someone, many helicopters, many soldiers, you be careful." "Yes," Vic nodded. "Careful." The old man smiled, showing gaps in his teeth. Then he said something else, and this time his meaning was unmistakable. "Valley battle, we hear stories, 2 women saved many soldiers." He touched his chest in a gesture of respect. He knew. Vic felt Sarah tense beside her. One word to authorities, one radio call, and this would end. They were at this man's mercy. The old man turned and spoke sharply to his group. They resumed packing, preparing to move on. Then he looked back at Vic and Sarah. "We see nothing. We go west, you go." He gestured vaguely. "Wherever you must go, travel safe." He walked away without waiting for a response. His group followed. Within minutes, they were distant specks moving across the landscape. "He knew," Sarah said quietly. "And said nothing," Vic finished. They watched the traders disappear. Maybe the old man respected what they had done. Maybe he had lost people in these wars and honored anyone who tried to save others. Maybe he simply didn't care about conflicts between foreign powers. Either way, he had given them something more valuable than food. He had given them the knowledge that not everyone would hunt them. They continued south. 3 days later, they reached the border zone. There were no signs, no fences, no official markers, but Vic could sense the change in the land, in the settlements, in the way people moved. This was the margin, the edge, the place where rules loosened and survival trumped ideology. They found a small town that existed primarily to service the gray market. Goods moved through here that couldn't move through official channels. People passed through who couldn't pass through official borders. Vic and Sarah needed exactly that kind of passage. They found a fixer in a tea house, a woman in her 40s, missing 2 fingers on her left hand, who conducted business in a back room filled with smoke and quiet conversations. Her name was Lena, and she had the hard eyes of someone who had survived things that would have broken softer people. Vic explained what they needed in simple terms. Transport across the border. No questions. Cash payment. Lena quoted a price that would take every coin they had plus their ammunition. No ammunition, Vic said. We keep our weapons, Lena shrugged. Then no transport. Ammunition is valuable. Your rifles without bullets are just expensive clubs. Sarah caught Vic's eye. They had a brief conversation in glances and minimal gestures. They had come too far to fail here. The ammunition was insurance, but it was insurance they might never need if they could just cross this last barrier. Agreed, Vic said, but we keep the rifles. Lena nodded. 3 days. There is a truck convoy leaving for the south. You ride in container with cargo. Uncomfortable, maybe dangerous, but you cross border and no one asks questions. How dangerous? Checkpoints sometimes search containers. If that happens, you are not our problem. You hide well or you face consequences. Vic and Sarah exchanged another look. They had faced worse odds. We'll be ready, Vic said. Lena collected their ammunition and half their remaining coins. The rest would be paid upon delivery. As they left the tea house, Vic felt lighter. Not physically, they had just traded away 2/3 of their combat capability, but mentally. This was the final obstacle. 3 days and they would be across the border, beyond the immediate reach of military pursuit, free to find their way home. 3 days. They found an abandoned building to shelter in a burned-out shell that had once been a warehouse. They took turns sleeping, conserving energy, preparing mentally for the final push. On the second night, Sarah spoke into the darkness. What do you think happens after we tell our story? Honestly, I don't know. Court-martial, probably. Maybe prison time. Maybe just discharge. Worth it. Vic thought about the young Marine in the valley, about the 1,000 lives that had seen another sunrise, about the principle that some orders were meant to be questioned. Yeah, she said. Worth it. They waited. The truck arrived before dawn on the 3rd day, exactly as promised. It was a commercial transport, old and diesel-powered, carrying legal cargo in the front containers and less legal materials in the hidden compartments. The driver barely acknowledged Vic and Sarah, simply pointing to a panel in the truck's side that opened to reveal a space maybe 6 feet by 4 feet by 3 feet tall. You fit, the driver said in broken English. You stay quiet. No move when truck stops. We tell you when is safe. Vic and Sarah climbed in. The space was smaller than advertised, cramped and airless. They had to lie on their sides, pressed against cargo crates that smelled of engine oil and something organic that had probably rotted months ago. The panel closed, plunging them into absolute darkness. The truck started moving. Vic tried to track time and direction by feel, counting turns, estimating speed. But after an hour, her sense of orientation was completely scrambled. She had no idea if they were going southwest or in circles. Beside her, Sarah's breathing was steady. Her sister had always been better at confined spaces, some gift of temperament that let her shut down claustrophobia through pure willpower. Vic focused on breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, staying calm. This was temporary, uncomfortable but temporary. The truck stopped. Voices outside, multiple voices speaking in official tones. Vic's linguistic skills weren't good enough to catch every word, but she recognized the cadence. Security forces. Checkpoint guards, people with authority and suspicion. The truck's engine shut off. Someone climbed onto the truck bed, footsteps moving along the containers, the sound of panels being opened, cargo being inspected. The search was thorough. Vic's hand found Sarah's in the darkness, squeezed once. Sarah squeezed back. Whatever happened now happened together. The footsteps came closer, stopped right above their hidden compartment. Vic held her breath. Through the thin panel, she could hear the guard breathing, could smell cigarette smoke. The man was standing directly on top of them. A voice called out in the local language. The guard responded. Vic's language skills weren't good enough to catch it all, but she heard two words clearly: American, and women. Lena had sold them out. The fixer had taken Command's money and given them up. The truck, the container, the whole setup, it was a trap. Sarah's hand squeezed hers tighter. This was it, the end of the line. But then the guard's radio crackled. A voice urgent, something about 50 miles east. A different location, wrong coordinates. The footsteps moved on. Vic didn't understand. If Lena had betrayed them, why were the guards searching the wrong area? More sounds, more inspection. Voices raised in question, answered by the driver in tones of bored routine. This happened every crossing. The guards searched because that was their job. The driver tolerated it because that was his. After 30 minutes that felt like hours, the engine restarted. The truck resumed motion. They had passed through the checkpoint. Vic exhaled slowly, relief flooding through her. Sarah's hand was still holding hers. Neither let go for the next hour. When the panel finally opened, daylight stabbed into the compartment like knives. Vic squinted against the brightness, muscles cramped from hours of immobility. The driver's face appeared in the opening. Across border, 1 hour to city, then you are not my problem. He closed the panel again, but looser this time. Air and light filtered through gaps. Vic could see Sarah now, could see the exhaustion and determination in her sister's face. Almost there, Sarah whispered. Almost, Vic agreed. When they finally climbed out into afternoon sunlight and city noise, there was a note tucked into Vic's gear bag. She pulled it out while Sarah kept watch. The handwriting was neat, precise. I reported you to command. They paid me $100,000. But I sent them 50 miles east. You have 48 hours. My son was in that valley. Staff Sergeant Dalton, run fast. Vic showed the note to Sarah. She played both sides, Sarah said. No, Vic corrected. She honored a debt her way. They burned the note, stripped their tactical gear, and walked toward the embassy district. The truck had continued for another hour, then stopped in what sounded like a busy street. The panel opened fully. They climbed out stiff and aching into afternoon sunlight and city noise. The driver pointed down the street. Embassy District, 4 blocks, you walk from here. He didn't wait for thanks. The panel closed. The truck pulled away. Vic and Sarah were left standing on a street corner in a foreign city, carrying rifles and wearing clothing that marked them as military even without insignia. They had to move fast. Drawing attention here was dangerous. They found an alley, stripped off their outer tactical gear, buried it in a dumpster. Underneath, they wore civilian clothes, wrinkled and dirty from days of travel, but unremarkable. The rifles went into hiking bags, broken down into components that wouldn't be immediately recognizable. Then they walked toward the embassy district. 4 blocks became 8 because they took an indirect route, checking for surveillance, ensuring they weren't being followed. By the time they reached the embassy gates, it was nearly dusk. The Marines on guard duty looked them over with professional suspicion. 2 exhausted women carrying heavy bags approaching right before closing time. We're American citizens, Vic said. We need to speak with someone, it's urgent. Nature of your business. Vic glanced at Sarah. This was it. Once they said the words, there was no taking them back. We're United States Marines, Vic said, and we need to report an incident. The guard's posture shifted immediately. Do you have identification? Vic pulled out her military ID. It was battered from 2 weeks of hard travel, but readable. Sarah did the same. The senior guard spoke into his radio. Within minutes, an embassy official appeared, a man in his 50s, dressed professionally, radiating competence and no-nonsense authority. I'm Commander Douglas Montgomery, Defense Attaché. The guards say you're Marines. Yes, sir. Captain Victoria Brennan and Lieutenant Sarah Brennan. We need to speak with you immediately, privately. Montgomery studied them. You're not on any embassy roster. Where's your unit? That's what we need to discuss, sir, privately. Montgomery made a decision. Come with me. They were escorted into the embassy compound through security screening into a conference room where they waited under the watchful eyes of more guards. Neither Vic nor Sarah was armed. The guards had confiscated their rifles, politely but firmly. After 20 minutes, Montgomery returned. With him was another officer, a colonel in Marine uniform, older, with the weathered look of someone who had spent decades in hard places. Vic's heart stopped. Colonel Nathan Ashford, their father's commanding officer, the man who had promised Michael Brennan he would look after his daughters, the man who had been on the command net when Protocol 7 was issued, who had heard them turn off their radios, who knew exactly what they had done. "Captain Brennan, Lieutenant Brennan." Ashford's voice was carefully neutral. "It's good to see you alive. We feared the worst when you went dark." Vic understood. They were being recorded. Everything said in this room would be used in the investigation. "Sir," Vic said, 2 weeks ago, 3rd Battalion Marine Regiment was ambushed in a valley approximately 200 miles north of here. Command issued Protocol 7, ordered all support elements to withdraw. Lieutenant Brennan and I were positioned as sniper overwatch. We disobeyed that order. We remained in position and provided fire support until reinforcements arrived. The battalion survived. We believe we will face court-martial for our actions." Montgomery's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Ashford remained perfectly still. "Protocol 7 is classified," Montgomery said. "How do you know about it?" "Because we received the order, sir, and because we broke it." "Can you prove your claims?" Vic pulled out a small notebook from her jacket, every entry she had made during their mission. Coordinates, wind readings, shots taken, times, distances. A complete tactical log of everything that had happened on that ridgeline. She also pulled out the journal from the cache. The confession of snipers who had obeyed Protocol 7 3 years ago and watched 400 Marines die. "Ballistics will match our rifles," Vic said. "Shell casings are still at the positions." The Marines in that valley can confirm someone provided sniper support, and Command knows 2 snipers went dark exactly when Protocol 7 was issued. Montgomery took both notebooks, scanned a few pages. His expression finally changed, not to anger or approval, but to careful calculation. "You understand what you're alleging, that you disobeyed a direct order during combat operations?" "Yes, sir." "And you understand the potential consequences?" "Yes, sir." "Then why turn yourselves in? You made it across the border. You could have disappeared." Vic glanced at Sarah. This was the question they had debated during the long nights of travel. Why not just vanish? Why face judgment? "Because the truth matters, sir," Vic said. "Because 1,000 Marines lived and someone needs to explain why Command was willing to let them die. Because if we disappear, the story gets buried. But if we stand up and tell it, maybe something changes." She tapped the journal from 2022. "This has happened before. Protocol 7 has killed before. We're not the first to face this choice. We're just the first who chose to save lives instead of careers." Ashford spoke for the first time. "Captain Brennan, Lieutenant Brennan, you're both under military authority as of this moment. You'll be held here pending investigation. I'll need to contact CENTCOM, get guidance on how to proceed." He paused. "This is complicated." "We understand, sir." "I'm not sure you do." Ashford stood. "You saved lives, Command will acknowledge that, but you also broke the chain of command during active operations. The military can't function if everyone gets to choose which orders to follow. You've put Command in an impossible position." "With respect, sir," Sarah said, speaking for the first time since entering the embassy, "Command put itself in that position when it issued Protocol 7. Ashford gave her a hard look. Then, surprisingly, he almost smiled. "That's between you and the court-martial board, Lieutenant. For now, you're both confined to embassy quarters." Vic and Sarah were led away, separated for the first time in 2 weeks. As the door closed behind her, Vic felt the weight of everything they had done settle onto her shoulders. They had made it. They were safe. They would tell their story, and then they would face whatever consequences came next. They held Vic in isolation for 3 days. A small room in the embassy basement. Bed, desk, chair, no windows. Meals delivered by guards who wouldn't make eye contact. She wasn't technically under arrest. No charges had been filed, but she was definitely in custody. The first interrogation came on day 2. 2 officers from the Inspector General's office, a colonel and a major, both wearing the careful expressions of people conducting an investigation that could become politically explosive. They went through Vic's notebook page by page, cross-referenced her statements against satellite data, battle reports, radio transcripts. They asked the same questions multiple ways, looking for contradictions or exaggerations. Vic answered everything truthfully. No point in lying. The evidence would either support her or it wouldn't. "You claim you engaged approximately 17 targets personally," the major said. "That's an extraordinary number for a single engagement." "I fired 47 times, sir. Confirmed kills, I estimate 17. The rest were suppressive fire or misses." "Your sister's numbers." Lieutenant Brennan fired from a different position. "She would have engaged approximately 15 confirmed targets from the southern approach. Combined, we estimate 65 enemy casualties, primarily leadership and crew-served weapons." The colonel leaned forward. "Why didn't you withdraw when ordered?" "Because withdrawing meant 3rd Battalion would be overrun by 0700, sir." "That wasn't your assessment to make." "No, sir, but it was the assessment we made anyway." The interviews continued for hours. They took breaks, came back with new questions, probed for inconsistencies. Vic answered until her voice was hoarse, then kept answering. On the 3rd day, they brought in Sarah. The sisters were kept separated, seated across a table in the same conference room where they had first made their report. They weren't allowed to speak to each other directly. The officers asked questions, directed answers. "Lieutenant Brennan, did your sister order you to remain in position?" Sarah looked at Vic, silent communication passing between them. "No, sir, we discussed options and came to the same conclusion independently." "So it was a joint decision?" "Yes, sir." "Who turned off their radio first?" Sarah paused. "Does that matter, sir?" "It establishes chain of command and responsibility." "We both turned off our radios within seconds of each other. I don't know who was first. I don't care." The colonel made a note. "You understand that disobeying Protocol 7 is a serious offense." "I understand that following Protocol 7 would have been a more serious offense, sir. 1,000 Marines would be dead." The interrogation went on. They were looking for something, evidence of conspiracy maybe, or proof of premeditation. Some legal angle that would make this easier to prosecute or excuse. Vic knew they wouldn't find it. She and Sarah had made their decision in the moment based on the situation in front of them. It wasn't planned, it wasn't malicious. It was just 2 Marines making the call they thought they had to make. Finally, after 8 hours of questioning, the colonel closed his file. "You'll both remain in custody pending command review. A court-martial board is being convened. You'll have access to legal counsel. In the meantime, you're restricted to embassy grounds." Vic and Sarah were escorted back to their separate rooms. Days passed. Vic Reed, exercised in her small room, thought about everything that had led to this point. She tried not to think about worst-case scenarios, years in military prison, dishonorable discharge, the end of everything they had worked for. But she couldn't stop thinking about the young Marine in the valley, whether he had gone home, whether he knew about the sisters on the ridge. On the 7th day, Montgomery returned. "You have a visitor." "Not official, not part of the investigation, but someone asked to see you, and I'm allowing it." He led Vic to a different conference room. Sitting at the table was Colonel Ashford. "Captain Brennan," Ashford said. "Sit down." Vic sat. "I've been briefed on what you and your sister did," Ashford said. "The IG showed me your tactical logs, your fire patterns, your casualty estimates." He paused. "You saved those Marines, all of them, and I'm here to tell you thank you." Vic didn't know what to say. Thank you seemed inadequate. "I'm also here to tell you," Ashford continued, "that what you did has created a storm at levels above both our pay grades. CENTCOM is furious. The Joint Chiefs are arguing about it. Politicians are asking questions." "I understand, sir." "I'm not sure you do. Protocol 7 exists for a reason. It's meant to prevent small unit leaders from making tactical decisions that have strategic consequences. You and your sister overrode that protocol." You decided you knew better than command. Yes, sir, we did. And you were right. Ashford leaned back. Those Marines, 1,000 of them, went home because 2 snipers decided to ignore orders. That's not supposed to happen. It's not how the system works, but it's what happened. Sir, are you testifying at the court-martial? That's why I'm here. I've been asked to provide testimony about the tactical situation, about what would have happened without your intervention, about the effectiveness of Protocol 7 in this context. Vic waited. This could go either way. Ashford could testify that they saved lives, or he could testify that they undermined command authority. Both were true. Which truth mattered depended on what the Corps valued more. I'm going to tell them, Ashford said slowly, that Protocol 7 was the wrong call. That the situation on the ground didn't match the assumptions behind the protocol. That those Marines would have been slaughtered if command's order had been followed. He looked directly at Vic. I'm going to tell them that you and your sister demonstrated the kind of tactical judgment that the Corps is supposed to train into its leaders, and that if exercising that judgment means court-martial, then the system is broken. Vic felt something unclench in her chest. Not relief, she was still facing charges, still looking at possible prison time, but validation. Someone who mattered, someone who had been there in spirit if not in body, was willing to stand up and say they had done the right thing. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. This isn't over. There are people in command who want to make an example of you, who believe that discipline matters more than outcomes, who think that letting you walk sets a dangerous precedent. Ashford stood. But there are also people, myself included, who think the real precedent is punishing Marines for saving lives. We'll see which side wins. He left. Vic sat alone in the conference room, processing what she had heard. The court-martial was coming. The judgment would be rendered. But at least now she knew that someone would speak for them, someone whose voice carried weight, someone who had been there in a way when the bullets were flying. It wasn't much, but it was something. The court-martial convened 6 weeks later at Marine Corps Base Quantico. Vic and Sarah were flown back to the United States under guard. They were processed, assigned legal counsel, given the formal charges, disobeying a direct order in time of combat, operating outside established chain of command, unauthorized engagement with enemy forces. The maximum sentence for each charge was years in confinement. Combined, they could face decades in military prison. Their lawyer was a captain named Graham Sutton, a JAG officer with 12 years' experience in military law. He was blunt in their first meeting. The facts aren't in dispute. You disobeyed orders. You broke protocol. Command has documentation of everything. The only question is mitigation. Can we convince the court that your actions were justified under the circumstances? Can we? Vic asked. Maybe. The challenge is that the military can't function if everyone gets to decide which orders to follow. The court has to balance your specific situation against the broader principle of discipline. Sutton spread out documents on the table between them. Our best argument is necessity defense, that following orders would have resulted in greater harm than disobeying them. But that requires proving command made the wrong call with Protocol 7. We have evidence, Sarah said. The tactical situation, the casualties that would have resulted, Colonel Ashford's testimony. And the journal from 2022, all of which will be countered by the prosecution arguing that tactical decisions aren't made by captains and lieutenants in the field. They're made by command with access to the larger strategic picture. Sutton looked at both sisters. Be prepared for this to get ugly. The Corps is divided on this. Some people see you as heroes. Others see you as a threat to good order and discipline. The trial will become a proxy for that larger debate. The court-martial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented their case methodically. Radio transcripts showing the Protocol 7 order. Testimony from the operations officer who had issued it. Expert witnesses explaining why battlefield commanders can't be allowed to freelance. The most damaging testimony came from Major Brendan Whitmore, the intelligence officer whose assessment had led to the ambush. Protocol 7 exists precisely because junior officers in the field don't have the information necessary to make strategic decisions, Whitmore said. Captain Brennan and Lieutenant Brennan believed they were saving lives, but they didn't know what resources were being marshaled for rescue. They didn't know the larger operational picture. They made a decision based on incomplete information and got lucky. Next time, that kind of freelancing could trigger an international incident or compromise a larger operation. Sutton Cross examined aggressively. Major, were resources being marshaled for rescue? The situation was being evaluated. That's not what I asked. Were resources actively being deployed to save 3rd Battalion? Whitmore hesitated. Not at the time Protocol 7 was issued. So the battalion was being abandoned. They were being evaluated as acceptable losses in a fluid tactical situation. Acceptable losses, 1,000 Marines, acceptable. Sutton let that hang in the courtroom. Major Whitmore, your intelligence assessment led to that battalion walking into an ambush, correct? Intelligence is never perfect. Yes or no, Major, your assessment said the zone was clear. It wasn't. Your assessment was wrong. The enemy's disposition had changed. Your assessment was wrong. And when your wrong assessment led to 1,000 Marines being trapped, Command issued Protocol 7 rather than acknowledge the mistake and commit resources to fix it. Isn't that the truth? The prosecutor objected. The judge sustained, but the seed was planted. The prosecution rested after 10 days. The court had heard extensive testimony about protocol, about chain of command, about the necessity of discipline in military operations. Now it was the defense's turn. Sutton called Colonel Marcus Fleming first, the commander of 3rd Battalion, the man whose Marines had been saved. Fleming testified for 6 hours, describing the tactical situation in detail, the enemy disposition, the inadequacy of his defensive position, the certainty of annihilation. At dawn, we had maybe 30 minutes of combat capability remaining, Fleming said. Then we would have been overrun. The sniper fire changed everything. Enemy lost command cohesion, lost initiative. That bought us 2 hours until reinforcements arrived. The prosecutor cross-examined. Colonel, do you believe junior officers should be allowed to override command decisions? I believe officers should be trained to exercise judgment. The Brennan sisters looked at the situation and made the calculation that saved 1,000 lives. That's what we trained them to do. Even when that action violated direct orders. Fleming paused. Then he said something that silenced the entire courtroom. I would rather be court-martialed for saving lives than decorated for following orders that led to massacre. Sutton called other witnesses, Marines from 3rd Battalion who had been in that valley, young men who testified with tears in their eyes about digging frozen ground, waiting for dawn, certain they were going to die. Corporal Jackson Dalton, the 19-year-old Vic had watched through her scope, testified last. I knew I was going to die, Dalton said, his voice breaking. We all knew. And then we heard the shots. Enemy officers dropping, chaos in their lines. Someone up there was fighting for us when everyone else had given up. He looked directly at Vic and Sarah. They saved us. I don't understand why that's a crime. The prosecutor objected. The judge sustained. Dalton's opinion on legality wasn't relevant, but the impact was made. The court-martial board, 5 officers ranging from major to colonel, had seen the human cost. They had heard what Protocol 7 meant in flesh and blood terms, not just strategic abstractions. Finally, Sutton called Colonel Ashford. Ashford testified about his relationship with Michael Brennan, about the promise he had made to watch over Michael's daughters, about their training, their record, their character. They did what I would have done, Ashford said. What any Marine with a conscience would have done. They saw 1,000 men about to die and they intervened. The prosecutor tried to discredit him. Colonel Ashford, isn't it true you have personal feelings for the defendants, that you're biased? I have professional respect for 2 of the finest snipers I've known. If that's bias, I'm guilty. Then Ashford did something unexpected. He pulled out a letter and handed it to the judge. "This is my resignation, effective immediately. I won't serve in a corps that punishes people for saving 1,000 lives. If the Brennan sisters are convicted and imprisoned for what they did, then the institution I've served for 30 years has lost its way, and I want no part of it." The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order. The prosecutor objected, but the damage or the inspiration, depending on perspective, was done. Ashford was willing to sacrifice his career for them, just as they had sacrificed theirs for 1,000 Marines they would never meet. Vic and Sarah both testified. Vic went first, calm, tactical, detailed. She described her thought process, her calculations, her decision matrix. "I weighed the options," Vic said. "Follow orders equals 1,000 dead. Stay equals a chance. I chose lives over career. I would choose it again." Sarah's testimony was shorter but equally firm. She pulled out the journal they had found in the cache, the one from the sniper team in 2022 who had obeyed Protocol 7 and watched their battalion die. "Other snipers faced this choice before us," Sarah said. "They obeyed, 400 Marines died, we broke protocol, 1,000 Marines lived. I'll let the court decide which was the right call." Sutton tried to introduce the journal as evidence. The prosecution objected, hearsay, chain of custody issues. The judge sustained the objection, but the board had heard it. They knew this wasn't an isolated incident. Protocol 7 had killed before. "Whether or not this journal is admitted," Sarah continued, "the facts are clear. This protocol has failed before. How many more battalions have to die before someone questions whether Protocol 7 itself is the problem?" The trial concluded. Closing arguments were made. The board retired to deliberate. Vic and Sarah waited for 4 days. On the 5th day, they were called back to the courtroom. The room was packed, media, veterans, Marines from 3rd Battalion. Word had spread during the trial. The Brennan sisters weren't just two defendants anymore. They were symbols of courage or insubordination, depending on who you asked. The board filed in 5 officers, their faces carefully neutral. The president of the board, a colonel with combat decorations from 3 wars, carried a folder containing the verdict. "The accused will stand." Vic and Sarah stood at attention. Their shoulders almost touched. They had faced everything else together. They would face this together, too. "The court-martial board has reached findings on all charges," the colonel announced. He opened the folder. "On the charge of disobeying a direct order in time of combat, we find the accused guilty." Vic's stomach dropped. She had expected this. The facts were undeniable, but hearing it stated formally still hit hard. "On the charge of operating outside established chain of command, we find the accused guilty." 2 for 2. One more charge remaining. "On the charge of unauthorized engagement with enemy forces, we find the accused guilty." 3 guilty verdicts. The maximum sentence now loomed: years in confinement, dishonorable discharge, the end of their military careers, and possibly their freedom. But the colonel wasn't finished. "This board has considered extensive testimony regarding the circumstances surrounding these violations. We have heard from commanders, from Marines whose lives were preserved, from experts on military protocol and tactical decision-making. We have reviewed the tactical situation in detail and assessed the likely outcomes had the accused followed orders." He looked directly at Vic and Sarah. "The board finds that while the accused clearly violated direct orders, they did so in a situation where following those orders would have resulted in catastrophic loss of American lives. We find that their tactical judgment, while outside proper chain of command, was sound and demonstrated the kind of initiative the Marine Corps claims to value in its leaders." Vic hardly dared to breathe. "Therefore, while upholding the guilty verdicts on all charges, this board recommends sentencing at the minimum end of available options. The accused are sentenced to reduction in rank of 1 grade, forfeiture of 1 month's pay, and formal reprimand to be placed in permanent record. No confinement. No discharge." The courtroom erupted. Spectators talking, reporters scrambling for phones, officers conferring in whispers. The colonel raised his hand for silence. This board further notes that Captain, now First Lieutenant, Victoria Brennan, and Lieutenant, now Second Lieutenant, Sarah Brennan demonstrated extraordinary skill, courage, and tactical judgment under pressure. While we cannot endorse violation of protocol, we acknowledge that rigid adherence to protocol in this instance would have resulted in unacceptable casualties. He paused, then continued with words that would echo through Marine Corps training for years to come. This court-martial should serve as impetus for review of Protocol 7 and similar doctrines, to ensure they account for the kind of tactical flexibility demonstrated by the accused. The Marine Corps trains its leaders to think, to adapt, to make hard calls under pressure. We cannot punish that training when it produces the outcome we claim to want, Marines coming home alive. He closed the folder. This court-martial is concluded. The accused are released from custody and returned to duty status pending administrative processing of these findings. The gavel fell. Vic and Sarah remained at attention for a moment, processing. They were guilty. They had been convicted. But they weren't going to prison. They weren't being discharged. They had been demoted and reprimanded, but they were still Marines. Outside the courthouse, Colonel Ashford was waiting. His resignation had been refused. The commandant himself had intervened, insisting Ashford remain in service. "Congratulations," Ashford said. "You're officially criminals with commendations." Vic wasn't sure she had heard right. "Sir, the board included formal commendations in your files. Extraordinary valor under fire. Exceptional tactical judgment. You'll have both a formal reprimand and formal commendations. Future commanders will have to decide which matters more." He shook both their hands. "I've already decided. If either of you wants a position under my command, you've got it." Sarah laughed, the first genuine laugh Vic had heard from her in months. "Are you sure you want snipers who don't follow orders, sir?" "I want snipers who know when orders are wrong and have the courage to act accordingly." "That's different than not following orders," Ashford smiled. "Think about it, no rush." 6 months later, Vic and Sarah were back in the field. Different deployment, new mission, same partnership. A situation developed, battalion in contact, enemy forces maneuvering for ambush. The radio crackled. "All sniper teams maintain overwatch. Situation developing. Request permission before engagement." Vic and Sarah looked at each other across the distance separating their positions. Something had changed. Command wasn't ordering blind obedience anymore. They were asking for judgment. "Overwatch 2, this is command. You have clear sight on enemy positions threatening friendly forces. Your assessment." Vic keyed her microphone. "Command, Overwatch 2, we have multiple targets of opportunity. Enemy preparing assault on battalion left flank. Recommend immediate engagement." A pause, then something Vic had never heard in 12 years of service. "Overwatch 2, permission granted. Your judgment is trusted. Engage at will." Vic settled into her rifle. Sarah would be doing the same. They had paid the price for breaking protocol. They had faced judgment. They had been convicted and decorated in the same breath, but something had changed. The system had learned, slowly and reluctantly, that sometimes the people on the ground see things that commanders hundreds of miles away cannot. Protocol 7 was under review. New doctrines were being written. The Brennan sisters' court-martial had become required study at Scout Sniper School and the Infantry Officer course. Not as a warning, but as a case study in battlefield initiative and moral courage. 2 rifles spoke simultaneously. Enemy positions eliminated. Threat neutralized. Battalion advanced safely. Vic thought of her father, buried in Arlington. Thought of the 1,000 Marines who had gone home from that frozen valley. Thought of Corporal Dalton, who was home now with a wife and newborn son, building the life he'd thought he'd lost in the darkness before dawn. Some shots were worth taking, even when you knew you'd pay for pulling the trigger. "Good kill, Vic," Sarah's voice came over the radio. "Good kill, Sarah," Vic replied. They packed their rifles and prepared to move. The mission continued. The war continued, but something fundamental had shifted. The Brennan sisters had proven that courage sometimes meant saying no to the people who thought they had all the answers. They had fired their shots at dawn. They had faced judgment at sunset. And they had survived to see another day, not just for themselves, but for the 1,000 lives that came home because two women decided some rules were meant to be broken when lives hung in the balance. Somewhere in Virginia, Corporal Jackson Dalton was home with his wife and newborn son, building the life he'd thought he'd lost in that frozen valley. He would never know the names of the ghosts on the ridgeline, but Vic and Sarah knew, and that was all that mattered.